What would make someone pull the trigger on a person they once claimed to love? It's a chilling question. A haunting one. And in the story of Livye Lewis, it isn't just about love. It's about jealousy, rage, and a decision that turned a normal night into an unthinkable nightmare. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary gathering. A party. Friends laughing, music echoing through the air, and young people enjoying the freedom of the night. But in the shadows, emotions were simmering. Silent, dangerous emotions. And as the evening unfolded, those emotions would explode with deadly consequences. Livye Lewis had her whole future ahead of her. Bright. Hopeful. Full of promise. She was just 19 years old. A daughter. A friend. A young woman who should have been safe. But jealousy doesn't care about innocence. Anger doesn't care about who deserves to live or die. And when a rifle was placed in the wrong hands, her life was stolen in an instant. One pull of the trigger. One deafening shot. One moment that destroyed everything. But this isn't just a story about a murder. It's about the terrifying truth of how quickly ordinary situations can spiral into horror. A house filled with laughter can become a crime scene. A young man's envy can turn into violence. And a single choice can leave an entire community reeling in shock. The night of the party started like any other. Drinks. Music. The kind of teenage energy that feels invincible. But behind the smiles, there was tension. A relationship strained. Feelings left unresolved. Jealous thoughts that grew darker by the minute. And as the night went on, those thoughts became impossible to ignore. Imagine being there. Imagine the sudden change in atmosphere. The music stops. The laughter fades. And in its place screams. Panic. Blood on the floor. Livye never saw it coming. No one did. The suspect, fueled by anger and consumed by jealousy, didn't walk away. He didn't choose restraint. He chose violence. And that choice left Livye lifeless, her future erased in the blink of an eye. Police were called. Neighbors rushed out of their homes. And as sirens cut through the night, a quiet suburban neighborhood became the center of a nightmare. Officers arrived to a scene that would haunt them forever. A young woman, gone. A suspect, holding the weapon that ended her life. And in that moment, every question became louder. Why her? Why then? Why did a party meant for joy end in such horror? The answers are disturbing. They reveal how jealousy can twist the mind. How rage can blind reason. And how fragile life truly is when darkness takes over. This case shocked the community, making headlines across the nation. Not because murders are rare, but because of the way it happened. So sudden. So brutal. So senseless. And as investigators began to dig into the events leading up to that night, the truth became clearer and even more chilling. Because at its core, this story isn't just about a crime. It's about the dangerous power of obsession. It's about how unchecked emotions can turn deadly. And it's about a young woman whose life was stolen before it ever really began. This is not just a case file. This is not just another headline. This is the tragic story of Livye Lewis. A party. Jealousy. And a rifle. Three elements that, when brought together, ended a life. And left everyone asking, could it have been stopped? To understand the tragedy of that night, we need to step back. We need to look at who Livye Lewis was, and how her path crossed with the person who would one day take her life. Livye wasn't just a name in a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman full of energy and dreams. At only 19 years old, her life seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, filled with possibilities. She was known for her kindness, her smile, and the way she could light up a room. People described her as someone who carried both innocence and determination, a girl who wanted to live fully, to love deeply, and to carve out a future she could be proud of. But like so many young people, Livye was also figuring things out. Relationships. Friendships. The messy, complicated steps of becoming an adult. And it was in those steps that she found herself entangled with someone whose emotions would one day turn fatal. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a random intruder. He was someone she knew. Someone she trusted, at least for a time. Their connection was complicated, part affection, part tension, and, ultimately, a dangerous mix of love and jealousy. On the surface, he seemed like any other young man. Outgoing at times, reserved at others. He had friends, he went to parties, he blended in. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. Insecurity. Possessiveness. A temper that lingered just out of sight, waiting for the wrong spark to set it off. For Livye, life was supposed to be about beginnings. New opportunities. The joy of being young. But for him, life seemed to be about control, holding on too tightly, even when things were slipping away. And it was that imbalance, that dangerous tug of war between freedom and obsession, that set the stage for the tragedy to come. Those close to Livye remember her as someone who loved to laugh. She wasn't hardened by the world yet. She was still trusting. Still hopeful. She saw the good in people. Even when there were warning signs, she didn't want to believe that someone she cared for could hurt her. But sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who smile at us. The ones who pretend to love us. The ones who, underneath it all, carry a storm of emotions they can't control. The weeks leading up to the night of the party revealed small glimpses of that storm. Arguments. Tense moments. A relationship that seemed to be fraying around the edges. Friends noticed it. Family felt it. But like so many situations, no one imagined it would escalate into violence. No one thought it could end in death. Livye had plans. She wanted to build her future, to step into adulthood with ambition and excitement. She was the kind of person who thought tomorrow would always come. But for the person by her side, tomorrow was filled with fear of losing her, fear of being replaced, fear of not being enough. And fear, when mixed with jealousy, can be a deadly weapon. It's important to remember that the story doesn't start with violence. It starts with two people. A girl filled with light, and a boy hiding shadows. It starts with ordinary moments, conversations, laughter, shared memories. But slowly, those ordinary moments turned into arguments. And those arguments turned into obsessions. The background of this case isn't extraordinary on the surface. That's what makes it so terrifying. Because it could have been anyone. Any young woman. Any relationship touched by control and jealousy. What happened to Livye wasn't the result of some master plan. It was the result of emotions spiraling out of control until they reached a breaking point. And while Livye was dreaming of her future, he was already planning how to keep her close no matter the cost. No one at the time could have predicted what was coming. But looking back, the signs were there. The tension. The anger. The jealousy. It all added up to something dark, something that would explode when the wrong night, the wrong argument, and the wrong weapon collided. Livye Lewis's story is not just about who she was, but about who she trusted. And in that trust lay the seeds of a tragedy no one could undo. Because while she saw a relationship, he saw possession. While she saw freedom, he saw betrayal. And that difference would lead them both to a night that ended in gunfire. Every tragedy has its warning signs. Subtle at first. Easy to dismiss. Easy to explain away. But when we look back, those small moments begin to form a pattern that foreshadows the darkness to come. With Livye Lewis, the warning signs were there. At the beginning, he seemed charming enough. He knew what to say, how to act, how to win her trust. But charm, when mixed with insecurity, can quickly twist into something else. What started as affection slowly began to feel like control. Friends noticed it first. He didn't like when Livye talked to other people, especially other men. A simple conversation could ignite suspicion. A laugh shared with someone else could spark arguments that seemed out of proportion. To him, attention was a currency. And if Livye gave it to anyone else, he felt robbed. There were fights. Not physical at first, but verbal. Intense. Heated. The kind of fights that left Livye drained, apologizing for things she hadn't even done wrong. He had a way of turning small disagreements into larger battles. A way of making her feel guilty for simply living her life. Then came the possessiveness. He wanted to know where she was. Who she was with. What she was doing. Texts that once felt sweet now carried an edge of interrogation. Calls that once felt caring now felt suffocating. It wasn't love, it was surveillance dressed as affection. Some of Livye's friends later recalled moments that unsettled them. The way his eyes lingered when she spoke to others. The way his mood could shift so suddenly, from calm to furious in seconds. It was like walking on a fault line, you never knew when the ground beneath would crack open. There were apologies, of course. There always are. Tearful words. Promises that it wouldn't happen again. And for someone like Livye, who still believed in his better side, forgiveness came easily. After all, she was young. She wanted to believe love could be repaired, that arguments didn't have to define a relationship. But red flags ignored don't disappear. They grow darker. Stronger. More dangerous. There were moments when Livye tried to set boundaries. Nights when she wanted to go out with friends, to enjoy herself without drama. But those moments rarely ended peacefully. He didn't like being left out. He didn't like the idea of her being happy without him. And his resentment grew deeper each time she pushed for independence. Neighbors would later recall overhearing arguments. Raised voices. Slamming doors. Nothing that screamed danger on the surface, but enough to suggest tension brewing behind closed doors. Enough to make people uneasy. Control soon turned into obsession. His jealousy wasn't just about who she talked to, but about the idea of losing her entirely. The thought of Livye walking away was unbearable to him. And instead of facing that possibility with maturity, he clung tighter. Too tight. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about power. And when love turns into power, danger is never far behind. Those close to Livye would later admit that they wished they had said more. That they had pressed harder. That they had told her to walk away before things got worse. But hindsight is always sharper than the present. At the time, it just looked like a rocky relationship, like the kind so many young couples go through. No one imagined it would end with a rifle in hand. Still, there were moments. Chilling moments that, in retrospect, feel like shadows of what was to come. His anger at the smallest things. His fixation on knowing her every move. His inability to let go, even when Livye tried to breathe. These weren't isolated incidents. They were building blocks. One on top of the other, stacking higher and higher, until the weight became unbearable. And when it finally collapsed, it didn't just crush their relationship, it crushed Livye's future. Because while the people around her saw arguments, he saw betrayal. While they saw normal teenage tension, he saw a threat. His emotions didn't fade, they festered. And with each fight, each perceived slight, the darkness inside him grew stronger. The rifle was still out of sight. The night of the party was still ahead. But already, the stage was being set. The red flags were waving, warning anyone who cared to notice. And yet, no one realized just how far it would go. But this was only the beginning. The night began ordinary. Music thumped. Glasses clinked. Laughter filled the room. No one expected sirens. Guests flowed in. Friends hugged. Livye moved through the crowd with a bright smile. He watched. Too long. Too hard. A jealous look. A tightening jaw. Small moments turned sharp. A whispered fight in the kitchen. A cold shoulder on the porch. People noticed but let it pass. Parties have drama. This felt different to those who knew the signs. Tension rose. Voices clipped. Words landed like knocks. The music became an uneasy soundtrack. He took her aside. Too close. Too quiet. Words exchanged behind closed doors. She pulled away. He followed. The follow felt like a threat. Someone suggested they take it outside. The backyard emptied and then filled. Breath fogged in the cool air. Friends circled. Eyes watched. He accused. Short sentences. You smiled at him. You left with him. She denied. Calm at first. Then tired. Then afraid. Her denials fed his fury. Every refusal became proof. A shove. A bottle fell. A chair tipped. A friend pushed between them. Voices rose into shouts. He retreated briefly. Came back carrying something long and heavy. A rifle. The sight of metal in his hands changed everything. The backyard's chatter died. Silence dropped like a weight. The moon seemed to pause. No one expected a weapon. Not here. Not tonight. But the rifle matched earlier warnings: small control, bigger threats. The rifle gave his jealousy a final voice. He walked toward her. Slow. Certain. His words were no longer pleas, they were demands. Ownership hidden as outrage. She stepped back. Fear showed in the smallest ways: shaky shoulders, quick breaths. Friends reached for her. Hands closed the space and he kept widening it. Let's go, someone pleaded. Begging only made him worse. He stepped closer. The rifle rose. Time broke into beats. Heartbeats. Footfalls. A single held breath. Everything thinned to one sharp point. He pointed the rifle. Control in cold metal. Loss and paranoia filled his mind. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was thinking about being replaced. About humiliation. She reached for him, a last attempt to reach sense. He recoiled. Her touch made him angrier. His hands trembled. The rifle scraped his palm. Words failed. A scuffle. The friend who had stepped in grabbed his arm. The rifle swung. Glass shattered. Screams exploded. The shot wasn't a movie boom. It was a sudden, hollow thunder. It took everyone by surprise. Heads turned. Bodies froze. A friend dropped to her knees beside Livye, hands frantic. Someone pressed down, calling her name. Phones flashed light across faces. A neighbor screamed. The backyard swung between chaos and stillness. Panic followed. People stumbled toward the gate. Phones came out with shaking hands. Someone called emergency. Voices strained to explain. Names spilled out in fragments. He stood in the hush, the rifle in his grip. For a beat he seemed shocked. Then something colder flickered. He didn't run. He didn't immediately drop the weapon. Sirens came, the long wail that slices calm nights. Police lights painted the street. Officers arrived and the scene turned official: questions, shoes, statements. The backyard became a frame for evidence. Friends would later recount moments that led to the shot. The small, repeated slights. The possessive texts. The way he watched her laugh. The tiny fights that never truly healed. The escalation was almost clinical in its simplicity. A look. An argument. A shove. A weapon introduced. A life ended. This night showed how quickly ordinary can become lethal. How small things, left unchecked, grow into something monstrous. How a rifle in trembling hands answers jealousy with finality. A party ended. A family shattered. A neighborhood changed. And even as emergency crews ran toward them, one question hung in the air: could this? It happened in seconds. But those seconds stretched into something much longer, something that felt like a lifetime to those who were there. The argument had already spun out of control. Voices were raised, accusations hurled, and the tension was thick enough to suffocate. But when the rifle appeared, the air changed completely. What had been a fight between young people suddenly became a scene of terror. Witnesses described the silence. That eerie, unnatural quiet that fell over the party as soon as the weapon was in his hands. The music stopped. The laughter stopped. Every breath felt sharp, every second dangerous. Everyone in that backyard knew what could happen, but no one wanted to believe it actually would. He held the rifle too firmly, like someone clinging to the last shred of control. His eyes weren't calm. They were wild. Unsteady. Full of jealousy, fear, and rage. It wasn't just about Livye anymore, it was about his pride. His ego. His inability to let go. Livye stood just a few steps away. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't begging. She was frozen, her body tense, her face pale with disbelief. Friends shouted at him, pleaded with him, tried to reason with him. But their words barely reached him. He was locked in, focused, consumed. Witnesses later said he looked like a different person. Not the boy they knew. Not the friend who came to parties. In that moment, it was as if something inside him snapped. The standoff was only minutes, but it felt endless. Some tried to pull her away. Others whispered to call the police. But before anyone could make a move, before anyone could step between them, he raised the rifle higher. And then, a shot tore through the night. It wasn't just the sound of a gun. It was the sound of a future being stolen, a life being ripped away in an instant. Screams filled the air. Someone dropped a glass. Someone else fell to the ground, covering their head. Panic exploded everywhere. Livye collapsed. Her friends rushed forward, frantic, desperate, their voices cracking with shock. They pressed their hands against her, calling her name, begging her to stay with them. Someone cried out for an ambulance. Another screamed at him to put the gun down. But he just stood there. Still holding the rifle. Still staring at what he had done. Some say he looked stunned, like even he couldn't process the reality of what had just happened. Others swore they saw no remorse at all, just emptiness, like he had been planning this moment in his mind long before it ever happened. The details are horrifying because they are so ordinary. No dramatic build-up, no long speech, no warning. Just a young man, a gun, and a split-second decision that destroyed everything. Neighbors who heard the shot rushed to their windows. Some came outside, only to be met with the sight of chaos. A girl bleeding. Friends screaming. A boy standing with a rifle in his hands. It was the kind of scene you expect from a crime drama, not from your quiet neighborhood street. Calls flooded into 911. Dozens of voices, frantic and panicked, all describing the same thing: she's been shot. Please, send help. Dispatchers sent officers racing toward the house, their sirens cutting through the night, their lights painting the streets red and blue. But nothing could undo what had already happened. When police arrived, they found Livye on the ground, surrounded by terrified friends who refused to leave her side. They found him nearby, the weapon still close, his hands trembling. Officers moved quickly, shouting commands, pointing their own weapons. Within moments, he was in custody. But the damage was irreversible. A 19-year-old girl, full of promise, was gone. A night of celebration had been transformed into a crime scene. and an entire community was left with the unbearable truth that a single act of jealousy had taken a life. The details haunted those who were there. The sound of the shot. The sight of her falling. The desperate cries for her to wake up. These weren't strangers, they were her friends, her peers, people who had grown up with her. And now, they were witnesses to the unimaginable. This was not just another headline. Not just another tragic story. This was the moment when everything changed. Because once the shot was fired, there was no going back. No apology could undo it. No explanation could soften it. A rifle had been raised. A trigger had been pulled. And Livye Lewis's story had been violently, tragically cut short. Her life ended in the blink of an eye. Her family's world shattered forever. And the questions left behind would haunt everyone who knew her. Why didn't anyone stop it sooner? Could the signs have been seen more clearly? Could the tragedy have been prevented? Questions with no easy answers. But one truth remains, a party meant for joy became the scene of horror. And a young woman's name would forever be remembered not for who she was becoming but for the night her life was stolen. The shot had been fired. Livye Lewis lay motionless on the ground. And in that single, devastating moment, the lives of everyone around her changed forever. When the first patrol cars arrived, the quiet suburban street was already chaos. Neighbors stood on their porches in shock. Friends screamed and cried in the yard. And there he was, the suspect, still near the scene, the rifle not far from his hands. Officers moved quickly. They shouted commands, weapons drawn, every second heavy with tension. For a brief moment, no one knew if he would turn the rifle on himself, or on them. But he didn't resist. He didn't flee. He simply stood there, as if paralyzed by what he had done. Within minutes, he was handcuffed, taken away under the flashing red and blue lights, while paramedics rushed to Livye's side. But it was too late. The wound was fatal. The young woman with so much promise was pronounced dead. The investigation began immediately. Detectives combed through the backyard, photographing every angle, collecting the rifle, marking the empty shell casing. Friends were separated, interviewed one by one, their statements echoing with disbelief. What emerged was a clear, chilling picture. The argument. The jealousy. The sudden decision to grab the rifle. Witness after witness described his obsession, his temper, his possessiveness. And now, those red flags were no longer warnings. They were evidence. The suspect was taken to the station, where detectives pressed him for answers. His responses were cold, fragmented, shifting between excuses and silence. He claimed he hadn't meant for it to happen. That it wasn't supposed to go that far. But the facts were undeniable. He had brought a rifle to a party. He had raised it. And he had pulled the trigger. The community's grief quickly turned into outrage. Vigils were held. Candles lit the night sky as family and friends spoke about Livye's kindness, her dreams, her future stolen too soon. At the same time, the town demanded justice. And justice would come. The trial that followed was heavy with emotion. The courtroom filled with family members, reporters, and a community desperate for answers. The prosecution laid out the evidence step by step: the toxic relationship, the growing red flags, the night of the party, and the rifle that turned jealousy into murder. Witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling as they relived the horror. Friends who had tried to calm him. Neighbors who heard the shot. Paramedics who arrived too late. Each testimony painted the same haunting truth: this was no accident. This was an act fueled by rage and control. The defense tried to argue otherwise. They spoke of immaturity, of a young man who lost control in the heat of the moment. They tried to frame it as a tragic mistake, not cold-blooded intent. But the jury saw through it. They saw the possessiveness, the pattern of jealousy, the escalation. They saw the rifle. And even in the courtroom, his face showed no regret. He sat emotionless as Livye's family wept just feet away. Not a single tear. Not a single sign of remorse. Just a blank stare, as if he couldn't or wouldn't face the reality of what he had done. When the verdict was read, the air in the courtroom shifted. Guilty. The word echoed, heavy, final. For Livye's family, it was a small measure of justice. But no sentence, no prison term, could ever bring her back. The judge's gavel fell. The suspect was led away in shackles, disappearing behind locked doors where his jealousy could never again reach another innocent life. But outside the courthouse, the pain lingered. Friends still carried the memory of that night. Parents still carried the weight of losing their daughter. And the community still carried the haunting knowledge that the warning signs had been there all along. The aftermath of Livye's murder wasn't just about one life lost. It was about the ripple effect, the trauma left behind, the lives scarred forever, the questions that would never be fully answered. Because the truth is chilling. This wasn't random. This wasn't unpredictable. It was the result of jealousy left unchecked, of anger left to grow, of red flags left ignored until it was too late. And while the justice system closed the case with a guilty verdict, the real closure never came. For Livye's family, every birthday, every holiday, every quiet evening at home was a reminder of what had been stolen. Her story became more than a headline. It became a warning. A tragic lesson in how quickly obsession can turn lethal. The courtroom delivered justice. But it could not deliver peace. And the haunting silence of that night still echoes, long after the gavel struck. The story of Livye Lewis is one that refuses to fade. It is more than a tragic headline, more than another case number filed away in court records. It is a reminder, a chilling reminder of how fragile life can be when jealousy, obsession, and rage collide. Livye was just 19. A daughter. A friend. A young woman with dreams stretching far beyond that night. She should have had decades of life ahead of her. But instead, her story was stolen in a single, violent moment. A party meant for joy turned into a nightmare that no one who was there will ever forget. What makes this story even more terrifying is its familiarity. It didn't happen in some dark alley, or at the hands of a stranger lurking in the shadows. It happened in a place meant to be safe. Among friends. With someone she knew. Someone she trusted. And that is what makes it so chilling, because if it could happen to Livye, it could happen anywhere. The warning signs were there. The jealousy. The controlling behavior. The temper that simmered beneath the surface. Friends saw glimpses of it. Family sensed it. But no one could have predicted how far it would go. Until it was too late. And that's the true weight of this story. That sometimes, the danger doesn't come from strangers at all. Sometimes, it comes from the very people who claim to love us. In the end, the justice system did its part. The suspect was found guilty, sentenced, and locked away. But while the courtroom gave closure on paper, it could never undo the loss. No sentence, no verdict, no number of years could ever bring Livye back. Her absence will always echo in her family's hearts, in her friends' memories, in the community that still mourns her. For those who loved her, every moment without her is a reminder of what was taken. Every empty chair at family dinners. Every birthday without her laugh. Every milestone she will never reach. That is the true aftermath of this crime. And so the question remains, what can we learn? The story of Livye Lewis forces us to look at the uncomfortable truth about relationships, jealousy, and control. It challenges us to recognize the red flags, to speak up when something feels wrong, to never dismiss possessiveness as just love. Because love doesn't control. Love doesn't suffocate. And love certainly doesn't kill. Even in the courtroom, his face showed no regret. No remorse. Just emptiness. And that may be the most haunting part of all because it shows how far obsession can strip away humanity. Livye's story is a tragedy. But it is also a warning. So I ask you, what do you think could have stopped this? Could anyone have prevented the moment that ended her life? Or was it always destined to spiral out of control once jealousy and rage entered the picture? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you believe, because conversations like these are how we keep stories like Livye's alive, and how we honor the lessons they leave behind. And if you found this story as heartbreaking and eye-opening as I did, make sure to like this video, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe for more true crime stories that reveal the darkest corners of human behavior. Livye Lewis deserved so much more than what happened that night. She deserved safety. She deserved love. She deserved her future. And while we cannot bring her back, we can carry her story, remember her name, and make sure her tragedy is never forgotten. Because in the end, true crime isn't just about the criminals. It's about the victims. The lives stolen. The futures erased. And the warnings we cannot afford to ignore. This was the case of Livye Lewis, where a party, jealousy, and a rifle ended a life.